In this session, we're going to continue our conversation about systems and strategies, and particularly how we embody our values, how we accomplish our mission, how we reach our vision. Once again, so that these are not just words on the page or ideas that we have, but that we can put these things into action intentionally, where we're shifting from the just kind of haphazard, hopeful kind of way of doing things to an intentional way of discerning together and living out what it is that God has called us to. And so, reminding once again of our values of this coaching process, that we're becoming spiritual leaders, loving, learning, and leading together in covenant. We're then creating environments that foster transformation in us as well as in those around us. And we are establishing processes that bear fruit. And so hopefully even reflecting on what we talked about in our last session, you're beginning to imagine the kind of environments and the kind of processes, the kind of strategies, the kind of activities that would help you in your disciple making. And so one of the ways to think about this is what environments are most transformative in the different stages of our disciple-making system. And so as we come to all of that, just a reminder that this ministry action planning process is a story of change itself. It's not designed to be simply a template. It's a story. Where are we now? Where are we headed? What are our foundations, our core convictions? And then how are we going to get to where God has called us to be? And so with those things in mind, I just want to jump back in where we left off the last time as we were talking about systems and strategies, reminding you again that our system and the strategies we're using are designed to move us from where we are, our context, to where God has called us to be, the vision. Being reminded that we're honoring those things that are our mission, our values, those foundational elements for us. And so as we look at this process again for building a system, first of all, we named our system steps, the 3 to 5 verbs that we're using. Then we gave definition in our last session together around each of those stages. And as I reminded you then, we're going to have to keep coming back and refining those definitions, but we at least tried to get kind of the ballpark of what are we talking about when we talk about each of these different stages. What do we mean by them? Then we walked through an exercise around the third step, which is what existing ministries do we have and where do they best fit in our disciple-making process? Which stage does each strategy or program or ministry, activity, whatever it is, where does it best fit? How does it best help us make disciples currently? And we actually did even some color coding of what things are really helping us well, what things kind of help us but could use some work, and then what things are, maybe they're not helping us at all, but at least we know where it fits in the system. And so what we want to do today is move into the remainder of these steps. And we're actually just going to focus on step 4 and 5 today. And then later on, once we've done some implementation, we'll come back and look at steps 6 and 7 where we're looking at the flow between the different phases or different stages of our disciple-making process, and then gathering data as we're implementing and saying, hey, is this actually working? And so we'll come back to those things down the road. And so as a matter of review, just leading into our new conversations today, naming the system steps, this is designed to be a cycle. We want it to repeat. And so step 1 leads to step 2. Step 2 leads to step 3. Step 3 leads to step 4. And then step 4 leads again to step 1. This is designed to be an iterative cycle, a process that's repeated. And the simpler it is, the better. At the same time, we want to make sure that it's comprehensive, that in other words, that we're not missing some major stage in our disciple-making process. And yet we want it to be simple, because simple things can be repeated, they can be multiplied, and that's what we're after. And so the second step then, we gave definition to each of these, where we're kind of naming what each of these stages are about. And then in step 3, we actually worked toward existing ministries and where do they fit. Are they helping us? Where do they best help us? And where are our gaps? And so in light of that, that leads us to this fourth step in our disciple-making process, in our system-building process here, and that is to actually begin to name some new potential experiments. And so I'm going to go back to the whiteboard here, and we will start this exercise simply with kind of a deep dive, a brainstorm, kind of a blue ocean or a blue sky kind of conversation where we're saying, hey, what are some potential ideas for how we can really engage in new kinds of experiments, new kinds of ministry. We love the language of experiment in this coaching process, and part of the reason is because many of us are prone to not starting something until we know we can get it perfectly. And unfortunately, what that does in a lot of congregations is the same thing it does for a lot of us individually. It means we get paralyzed. We don't actually do anything. And so we love to talk about this as new ministry experiments. And what we're doing right now is, just because we mention something doesn't mean we're going to do it. And so I want you to relax a little bit, take a deep breath as you enter into this exercise, and begin to think about, well, what could we do? Remember, we serve the God who's able to do more than we can ask or even dream, from Ephesians 3:20. And so if that's true, then what is God dreaming? We've had lots of dreaming conversations. What new ministries, new experiments might we think about? And so this could be literally something new, like something we've never done before, or it could be something that's renewed. In other words, this is something we've done, but it doesn't have a lot of life anymore, and so could we try something new? Just a quick example, one of the churches I was coaching in recently, they have a kind of a coffee hour in their congregation, which they call 1024, which is from Hebrews 10:24. Don't neglect meeting together. And so that was cute. Their whole hope with this is that it built relationship. It fit into this relate stage. Now, they called it something different, but it fit into this stage of their disciple-making process. They realized it doesn't really have a lot of life anymore, and not a lot of people come to it. And the people that come, they literally just kind of drink coffee and talk to each other. And so they begin to think about, how could we renew that ministry? It's not effective. It was orange on their chart, but could it become green? Could we do something different with it? In other ways, begin to think about, well, we're like have a major gap in one of these areas. We're probably going to have to come up with something completely new. And so as we enter into this, once again, it's kind of a pure brainstorming kind of exercise. And if you get partway through this and you feel stuck, like we don't really have a lot of great ideas, then I might encourage you to go on a field trip. Go visit a church that has some strengths in some areas that you have some gaps. Or perhaps not even a church. You know, if you have a weakness in hospitality, you know, maybe go visit a hotel that does hospitality well, like a Ritz-Carlton, or go to Disney and see how they do hospitality. If you're struggling with outreach, maybe you go visit a church or an organization that actually reaches out into the community quite well, a nonprofit or a local church ministry. And so as you're brainstorming, we're just going to kind of walk through this. And the first thing in this exercise that I want you to look at is, once again, by what we see on our chart in terms of existing ministries, where are some of our strengths and where are some of our weaknesses? And so just practically, as we look at the mock exercise we did in the last session, we can say, well, we already have some strengths in relate and somewhat in equip, but we don't have much going on in the outer stages, and we don't have a lot going on in equip. And so one of the things that people are prone to is brainstorming new ministry ideas that fit into the stage you're already really good at. And that makes a lot of sense. It's something that's a strength. We want to do even more of it. Now, I'm not discouraging you from brainstorming things that you're already fairly good at, but the primary purpose of this exercise is to do some brainstorming and thinking about new experiments in the stages of your disciple-making process that are gaps for you. In other words, that are things that are not your strengths. Could we add strength there? And so I want to start by looking at this engage. And remember, in our definitions, we talked about things that are outreach, things that are outside the walls of the church, where we're connecting to people who are unchurched. We're getting out there with people. And so we have a soup kitchen now, but we said it's not going very well. There are not very many people involved in it. And perhaps we don't know of a single person that ever went to soup kitchen and then ended up connected to one of these ministries in the relate stage. And remember, the whole point of this process is these ministries ought to help people move here. They're not designed to just be a silo, hey, look at us, we did this one thing really well. But what things could help people move from this stage to this, from this stage to this, and repeating again and again. And so we might start brainstorming and thinking about what kind of outreach things might we do in our community to really engage with people that are non-believers. And so maybe we start to think about some sort of affinity group. In other words, you got somebody in your church that really loves to play golf, and or a set of folks that do. Maybe there's a way out on the golf course to begin to have some believers from your congregation and some non-believers do something together. You got folks that really like to do a whole variety of things. Maybe they're at the gym. They're going specifically out to a gym already. Maybe it's a way to build some sort of group outside the walls of the church. We can do that. Maybe we start doing like a quarterly outreach event out in the community in some sort of way. And to serve folks, maybe a lot of stuff for kids, things that we could actually try. And so we might come up with several ideas. Now, once again, just because we put it on the whiteboard doesn't mean we're going to do it. We're simply brainstorming. Okay. Now we might say, well, we already have quite a lot of stuff going on here. So at least for this exercise, let's skip over here and think, well, what could we do to really better equip our people? Some of our stuff's going fairly well, but a lot of our people, if not very many people are actually being sent and we're not engaging, maybe this is one of the weak areas, and we might say, maybe we might try covenant groups. Instead of just small groups, but people actually in covenant together, and they're accountable for their spiritual growth and these sorts of things, okay? And so maybe that's an idea we share here. Maybe we come over here to send, and we say, well, what kinds of things could we do here? And we might think, well, what about some sort of study on spiritual gifts? And maybe even more than just spiritual gifts, but something that would really help people learn who they are in Christ. What about some training in faith sharing, like relational evangelism? And so, once again, I'm just adding a few here. You might come up with a giant list of things, of the types of potential ministries you might try. And then what we have to do is look at this, and it may be that you save it till the next meeting. But to spend some time in prayer and discernment of, God, what kind of bubbles to the surface? And one of the encouragements we would have is you don't want to try more than one or two new experiments at a time. The point is not to try all of these and see what works. The point is to say, what do we feel like God is really calling us to? What is a big gap? What would be a catalyst for other things happening? And maybe we try one or two new experiments in this coming season. And we figure out who's going to kind of help oversee that. And do we need to recruit some other people to be a part of it? And so we're going to talk more about those kind of things in one of the upcoming sessions. But just to begin to think about prioritizing what we might do next. So what is doable for us? What would stretch us, but what is actually doable? Can we afford it? What does that look like? And so this is a brainstorm exercise where there's no limits. And then as we begin to discern and prioritize, we start to think about what could we actually do and by when? What feels like we ought to do it first? And some of this could emerge simply because of the passions and sense of calling with people right there on your team. You may have somebody on your team that says, I can't sleep at night. I've been thinking over and over and over about the fact that we need to have covenant groups, and not just regular small groups, but actually help people build covenant. And you might find somebody that's the kind of leader that is ready to step into some of that. Maybe build a team around it. Maybe start the first covenant group as an experiment. And so that's the kind of thing we're thinking about, is what things could your team actually initiate as experiments, and not expect them to go perfectly the first time. We're going to come back to how we're going to get better and better and better in our next session at doing these kinds of things, okay? And so, but this is simply brainstorming and then beginning to prioritize. What is God calling us to try first? And it may simply be one thing, maybe two, but things that your team is most convicted about, passionate about, and ready to actually take a risk in some sort of way to move into some new ministry, okay? And so I want to move then to the next conversation here, and that is around vital signs, okay? And as we do so, just want to highlight a little bit of background on this, okay? And so establishing vital signs for each of your system steps could feel a little complicated. This is actually designed to be very simple. So you'll see some guidelines on the screen right now. When developing vital signs, it's helpful to remember that they can be changed after evaluation. In other words, if something's not working, you can change your vital sign, what we're actually using as a guide, as a measure for us. Vital signs reflect the current reality as it changes over time. innovative vital signs, in other words, if we get creative with what we're actually measuring, then it can give more energy to tasks. Many vital signs have a time component. In other words, we're going to do this by this certain time. And if possible, vital signs need to be quantifiable, tangible in some sort of way. And so people often say things like, well, a lot of what we're hoping for in the church is really subjective. We want spiritual growth to happen. Well, that's true. How would we actually know whether it is happening? So those are the kinds of questions we're going to ask in this next exercise. I want to give you just some examples to kind of get your mind running in this, and then we'll do a quick mock exercise around this. And so as you think about, and once again, for this, what you see on the screen, we've just assumed a 4-step process. You may have 3, 4, or 5 steps in your own team. And so, but one way to think about this would be, what are we hoping happens by the end of stage 1? That's what we're talking about with vital sign. Okay, what are we actually hoping for at the end of each stage? So at the end of stage 1, we would hope that Christians actually have relationship with non-Christians, and people are responding and they want to get involved in the life of the church. So in other words, they're moving from step 1 to step 2. And so at the end of step 1, we would want this to be something that is true. In step 2, what would be a vital sign for us? Well, that people would respond to their exposure to the church and desire to grow in their knowledge of Christ, that they actually get in real relationship with the people of the church, and most particularly with Jesus. So at the end of stage 3, what would we hope for? Well, that people are growing in their faith, that they're growing in knowledge as well as they want to do something. They want to practice their faith in some sort of way. And then finally, in stage 4, what would we hope is true at the end of stage 4? Well, the people are using their gifts, and they're beginning to live into their own sense of calling, both inside the church as well as outside the church, so that this repeats again and again. And so these examples that you were seeing on the screen are fairly simple, but hopefully provides some highlight for you on what we're looking for in this vital sign conversation. I will tell you this, as we get into the next major phase of this coaching process, we'll come back to vital signs and do some more detailed work around this. What we're trying to do right now is simply get a beginning point of what would we hope for at the end of each stage. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, I don't really like this language of measuring things. That's kind of the way the business world does stuff. And it's part of the reason why we're using the language of vital signs, because the whole point of this is not about numbers for us. The point is, are we being faithful to our calling to make disciples? And if we are, there ought to be evidence of that. And so Jesus said over and over and over in his ministry that a tree is known by its fruit. And so we ought to be able to see evidence that something is working. This is why a follower of Christ, where God is really working in our lives, the fruit of the Spirit ought to be showing up in us. Love, joy, peace, patience, and the like. And so those things, that fruit is a demonstration that some reality is actually happening. And so we want to see what is the fruit or the vital sign, the measure of health at the end of each of these stages. And so even the language of vital sign, every time you go to the doctor, they check your pulse, they check your weight, they check your temperature. They check your blood pressure. These are all vital signs. And if those things are near the mark that they're supposed to be, then you're more than likely you're healthy. But if they're not, then it indicates a lack of health. And so part of what we're trying to do is kind of set what is the 120/80 of blood pressure for what we want by the end of the engaged stage, okay? And the same for each of these, whatever language that you're using. And so with that in mind, I just want to give you a couple quick examples, and then I'll let you kind of enter into this conversation yourselves. And then, as I said, we'll come back and refine a lot of the work around vital signs later on. And so if what we're hoping for is at the end of this stage is that people are ready for this, then what would we hope happens here? And we might be thinking about, for instance, saying we want to have 4 events this year. That's something we could check off on, like, yes, we did that. Outreach events, okay? And that maybe along with that, we might say we want to have a certain number of new relationships that we've built, okay? And obviously that would be dependent upon your own context, but for today's exercise, let's say we name a number. We'd like to have 4 events each year, and we'd like over the course of the year to build 10 new relationships, okay? And so you see I've got a time frame on this, okay? Then in the relate stage here, we might say that, you probably already have to measure professions of faith. And so, let's say that we'd like to have, a certain number of professions of faith, maybe 6 in the course of the year. So every other month, we have a profession of faith. That's probably something you already have to measure, and that would indicate whether this is happening. And so maybe over here we look at this and say, what's our current percentage of people that are in our in small groups? And we want to increase that, okay? And so let's say we've got 10% now. We might say 15% by the end of this year. And so we're saying we have a goal that will help us here. And then, maybe we've got, we want to do something like the percent of people in a gift database over here, where we're saying by the end of this year, we'd like to have, 75% of our people in our church in a database that shows us what their spiritual gifts are. Okay, so these are just examples for you, but I want you to begin to think about the kinds of things that would help you know whether or not you're making progress in each of these stages. As I wrap up today, just going to highlight the last couple steps and once again say that we're going to come back to these later, but we want to make sure the different stages of our system flow together, that they're not just silos. And so we're going to come back to that as we actually practice with this a little more. And then finally, we'll begin gathering data on, is it actually working? And so you'll see on the screen a simple example of some different existing ministries and new ministries and different colors and whatnot should mirror the kind of thing that you've seen me do on the whiteboard. And so your actual assignment for today's session, once again, is specifically to look at new ministry experiments and to look at some vital signs, just beginning stage of that. And then we'll pick up from there in our next session.